So, Aaron, we have seen the incoming Trump administration start to fill out in the last few days. We've reported here at the Post that President-elect Donald Trump has chosen Kristi Noem, who's the governor of South Dakota, as the next Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security. We also have some reporting that Florida Senator Marco Rubio is expected to be nominated as the next Secretary of State. And I just want to get your reaction to these names. What do you think about that?
My favorite thing about the Marco Rubio apparent pick for Secretary of State is that Trump in 2016, when they were running against each other, said, Marco Rubio is a total lightweight who I wouldn't hire to run one of my smaller companies.
Oh.
And now he's picking this man to run his foreign policy.
Yeah.
This is not the only example of Trump bashing someone and then they come around to them eventually. But that tweet is just so perfect for this. And it shows how politics shift over time for sure. Welcome to the Campaign Moment from the Washington Post, your guide to the biggest developments of the day. I am Aaron Blake, senior political reporter here at the Post and author of the Campaign Moment newsletter. It is Tuesday, November 12th, and today I'm joined by producer extraordinaire and my friend Laura Benshoff to co-host this episode. Hey, Laura.
Hey, Aaron. Wow, producer extraordinaire. Did I just get a raise?
I mean, you should if you haven't.
Did I just get a promotion? Just kidding. Just kidding, Washington Post.
I'll talk to some people.
Thank you.
So today we're going to be discussing President-elect Donald Trump's to-do list. Donald Trump previewed a lot of very far-reaching and some would say extreme policies on the campaign trail. And a big question right now is how much he intends to actually pursue those things and then what would happen from there.
Totally. Aaron, we're in this kind of interesting moment where campaigns are often, a candidate pitching their ideal version of the country, right? They get to dream big and talk about all the sweeping changes they would make, but then the election ends, and as things start to look more real and the rubber has to hit the road, you end up kind of figuring out, okay, what does it mean to turn this wish list into reality? So yeah, what we're going to do today and why I'm here is to sort of help unpack some of the analysis that you recently did, Aaron. You looked at some of these really ambitious Trump policy proposals, and you dug into what we actually know about the public opinion polling on them. So how popular are these individual policies that got Trump reelected? How popular are they with the public? And so we're going to kind of go through them category by category, and you're going to help me and everyone else understand what is the mandate for these individual policies, or what's the potential, reaction to if Trump rolls out some of these things that he's campaigned on. So we're going to start with immigration. This is a topic that I actually used to report on during the first Trump administration, and Trump talked about the border and he talked about migration a ton on the campaign trail. And one of his big promises from the campaign is that he is planning what he's calling mass deportations of undocumented immigrants.
To me, the worst is the border, because it's what they're doing is they're destroying our country. And it's not easy. We're going to get them out. We're going to have the largest deportation in history. I'm not proud to say that either, but it's a tough thing to do.
And a number that I always think of when I hear this promise is there's more than 11 million people in the U.S. who fit this category. That's according to the Center for Migration Studies, which is a nonpartisan immigration think tank. So we're talking about potentially pulling out millions and millions of people who've been living in the U.S. I'm curious, Aaron, how do Americans view that promise?
I think this poll question over the last couple of years has been one of the most remarkable ones that we have seen. During the Trump presidency, there was actually a lot of goodwill for immigrants, even though he had run on a very anti-immigration platform in 2016. People really warmed to the contributions of immigrants. They warmed to immigrants more broadly. But as the border crisis raged early in the Biden presidency and in the first few years, we saw people really warm to this idea of mass deportation. Generally speaking, people were at least evenly split on the idea, and even using what the pollster described as detention camps, which is something that obviously carries all kinds of historical parallels. These are ideas that the American people really warmed to. And so some of the pre-election polling showed a majority of people said that they supported the idea of mass deportation.
Was it a big majority or like about half? What were you, like, how big of a mandate are we talking about?
Yeah, so it was often evenly split, but in an ABC Ipsos poll a couple months before the election, it was actually a 56-43 majority in favor of this proposal. And so that's a significant degree of support. I think that, and this is something that we're going to be returning to on a number of these proposals, is that the devil's kind of in the details on this. As you mentioned, this is such a massive proposal and very costly. Trump has even talked about the idea that removing some undocumented immigrants could get, quote, bloody. So these are things that could be hugely contentious once they're actually implemented. And the other thing that I think is important to note here is that people tend to have pretty contradictory views on this. So they'll say that they like the idea of mass deportation, but a lot of those people will at the same time say that they like the idea of a path to legal status for undocumented immigrants. In a poll recently, CNN asked people to basically choose between those two options, between mass deportation and a path to legal status. And people chose the path to legal status 2-1. So I think there's a real question here about how considered this support of mass deportation is and how it would hold up over time once this policy is implemented. Surely this is a huge proposal, one with all kinds of unintended consequences. And so I think it becomes an issue of like, do people really understand the scale of the people that this could ensnare? Do they realize that this could lead to family separations of undocumented people who have children who are citizens because they have birthright citizenship? You know, these are all very dicey and difficult issues that would all come into focus if this is a large-scale mass deportation program.
Absolutely. And that's so interesting. What I hear when you brought out those last poll numbers, Aaron, is people rejecting the status quo. They don't like the way that our immigration system works now, you know, and it sounds like they're in favor of various kinds of changes, whether they're more punitive changes like mass deportation or, as you said, in favor of changes to our legal system to make a legal process easier. Some of this is going to come down to who can do what. I mean, we saw that a lot in the first Trump administration. You know, the president leads the executive branch, and the executive branch does have some sweeping powers to determine who can or cannot enter the country. But for things like changing a legal path, you need Congress.
I think that's right. Yep.
Okay. I want to move to the next topic area, which is another huge one, key cornerstone of Donald Trump's campaign, and that's the economy. This is something that I felt like so many voters that I spoke with and other folks in our newsroom spoke with talked about day in and day out. So we're just going to hear from a couple of them right now.
Economics. I mean, you know, the tariffs on China versus what we're doing. You know what I mean? I believe Trump is definitely an American first.
For me, it's just like, you know, the economy's been rough the last 4 years for a lot of people. And
foods cost so much. I got kids' college tuitions I got to pay. You know, it just can't make ends meet.
That was Joe Castaneda, Lucas Gottschalk, and Santo Montecalvo. They all spoke with me or other folks in the Post newsroom on Election Day and brought up the economy when asked about what they're concerned about. We're not going to talk about every single proposal that Trump has made around people's, you know, home finances or the economy writ large. But that first person, Joe Castaneda, mentioned a big one that Trump has promised, which is tariffs. And a tariff is basically a tax on imports. It's meant to encourage more manufacturing within our country as opposed to, you know, Americans easily buying goods that were made elsewhere. Let's hear Trump talking about that now.
So I said, I've had it. And I started talking about tariffs. We're going to put massive tariffs on these companies that are coming in and destroying our jobs and our companies.
So Donald Trump has proposed tariffs as high as 20% on all imports across the board. And he's suggested putting even higher tariffs on imports from China, potentially 60% or more.
Tariffs. I love tariffs. I love tariffs, what they can do for your income and protection, and even third-party things you can do just by the threat of tariffs, because we're the pot of gold. We won't be the pot of gold long if we don't do something.
So Tariffs is a kind of a wonky word, but Aaron, I'm curious, how do Americans feel about this plan about making goods from other countries more expensive here?
This one is a little bit more difficult to understand when it comes to what the American people think or what they might ultimately think when this policy is enacted. And that's because, as you mentioned, this is a complicated thing. Trump basically pitched these as taxes that would be paid by foreign governments, which isn't strictly how this works. You know, there is a place for tariffs, but the benefit is generally that you are trying to make American industry more competitive with imports and things like that. So it is something that polls popularly, the idea of tariffs. So there was a Reuters Ipsos poll in September that showed Americans said they were more likely to back somebody who supported Trump's tariff proposals, about 53% to 42%. So this is something that they heard about and generally liked. But it's also evident that people could be swayed against this if it doesn't go well. I'm thinking in particular about a February poll from YouGov. It went in a little bit more detail on this and asked about, what happens if these tariffs lead to higher prices for you? That's the downside of tariffs, is that it raises prices. And the poll showed that just 61% of people who said they wanted increased tariffs stood by that proposal when it was attached to the prospect of higher prices for consumers. And so this, I think, is somewhat similar to mass deportation in that it gets at how the implementation of it could make this policy seem a lot less appealing to people. We don't know how it's going to play out, but certainly the way it could play out is a lot different than Trump has been pitching it on the campaign trail.
Right. And you were saying, he talked about it as, this is something that other people, other countries, companies from outside the U.S. will pay. But if I'm hearing you correctly, our understanding of tariffs is that often that's not how this works, that it could increase people's household costs, right?
Yeah, and there are, plenty of studies on the economic impact of this. And there is a real fear that these broad and extensive tariffs could lead to significant inflation. You're talking about an economy that relies so extensively on imports, and suddenly all of those imports cost more.
Super interesting. Okay, let's take a quick break here. And after the break, Aaron, I'm going to ask you more about how the American public feels about some of Trump's most sweeping overhauls of government.
We'll be right back.
Okay, Aaron, another huge area of government policy that could change in a second Trump administration is healthcare. There've been proposals related to things like, for example, getting rid of vaccine mandates. We saw Trump potentially tapping the former presidential candidate, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who is a vaccine skeptic, as someone who could help lead healthcare policy in the U.S. in a second Trump administration. What do we know about the vaccine mandate? What do people think about that?
This seems to be something that they are leaning into. We don't know specifically what it might ultimately look like, but we have seen over the last several years a significant uptick in vaccine skepticism on the right. It's not just the COVID vaccine either, but that's really what got this ball rolling. They've started to call into question the necessity of vaccine mandates for things like the MMR, measles, mumps, and rubella vaccine for school children. It's kind of ensnared all of these vaccines, and the elevation of Robert F. Kennedy Jr., I think, is a signifier that this is something that Trump could take seriously and try to do in a second administration. And so it's difficult to understand the vaccine issue. But if you look at the polling numbers, you still see that the American people more broadly believe that things like the MMR vaccine are safe and effective. There was a Pew survey that showed that 9 in 10 people think that that's a safe and effective vaccine where the benefits outweigh the supposed drawbacks. And so it's to the point now where there was a Gallup survey this year that showed only about half of people supported keeping the MMR vaccine mandatory. There is a significant portion of the country that thinks that this should not be something that's mandatory anymore. This one is maybe the most difficult one to understand as far as public opinion goes, but it's something that could have very significant impacts and a potentially significant backlash.
So if I hear you correctly, the vast majority of Americans think that vaccines, commonly given childhood vaccines, like you keep mentioning the MMR vaccine, are safe and effective. They think that they're good and they work, but they do not like that the government makes you vaccinate your kids.
Correct. There is a huge gulf between those two things. So 9 in 10 people think the MMR vaccine is safe and effective, but only about half think that it should be mandatory. And so, even if it's not necessarily something that Trump decides to do at the federal level, does this kind of, momentum against vaccines on the political right lead some local school districts to decide not to require these vaccines? Does it cause some Republican, state legislatures to take some action? We saw a little bit of that in recent years in a couple states where they talked about the idea of, maybe not making these vaccines mandatory, and then they soon backed off of it. But clearly the momentum has been in that direction on the American political right, and which, how far Trump and Robert F. Kennedy Jr. want to go with this is going to be a major question for public health moving forward.
Yeah, one of the big ones. I want to go into one final category of sort of big overhauls or changes that President-elect Donald Trump has proposed for his second term. And these are things that are in the category of, I guess I would just say, use or administration of government. So, for example, one of the things that Trump has talked about is that he'd like to replace large swaths of the federal workforce. So the federal government agencies and departments are staffed often by these career civil service employees. Trump totally wants to overhaul that process and maybe change out a lot of people in those seats. Is that something that the public has a strong feeling about or wants to happen?
Yeah, now we're getting into policies that seem to be overwhelmingly unpopular with the American people. And this would be high on that list, at least according to what we know now. So, yeah, this is actually a little surprising to me because, government bureaucrats are not the most, sympathetic of characters. And I think a lot of people, might think, well, of course he should be able to replace government officials with people that he likes better. Like, what's wrong with that?
Right. Shouldn't the president have that prerogative, right?
Yeah. I mean, he can do that with political appointees and things like that. But we're talking about civil servants who are nonpartisan, who are career people who have been in these jobs for long periods of time. And that's something that the American people strongly reject. There was a Reuters Ipsos poll earlier this year that showed people disagreed with the idea of firing civil servants for disagreeing with administration policy by a 67-11 margin. And they disagreed with doing this because those civil servants may do their job in a way the president doesn't like by a 63-15 margin. Those are just two different ways of kind of describing how this could potentially be implemented. And both of them earn huge opposition, including significant opposition from Republicans. So this is something that I think if Trump ultimately decided to pursue it could prove to be very unpopular. Now, would people care that much? I don't know. Maybe if these government programs are kind of hamstrung by this, they might object to it more. But this seems to be on its surface something that people are very strongly against.
That's really interesting. I think given that this election is being talked about in some ways as a change election, voters really rejected the status quo and the way things have been done for the last 4 years and maybe for longer, feeling like they want big shakeups in institutions, but it almost sounds like this is sending the opposite signal that not this type of shakeup or don't go after sort of, your line level bureaucrat when you make these big overhauls. That's so interesting to me.
Yeah, people like change. They don't always like the kind of change that they ultimately get. I think that's something that's pretty clear in American history.
And then one other area I would say sort of like use or administration of government is that, Donald Trump has talked a lot about the people that stormed the Capitol on January 6th, 2021. He's called them patriots. This is a big group of people some of whom have been found guilty in federal court of crimes against the government. And he's talked about pardoning potentially some of these folks. How do Americans feel about him just waiving pardons and dumping these criminal convictions for folks that have been convicted for their actions on January 6th?
Yeah, this is also one that I think could really blow back on Trump if he winds up doing it. This is a significant cause for him, and it's something that he campaigned on extensively. But there is very little indication this is something that the American people want. There was a CNN poll earlier this year, shortly after the third anniversary of January 6th, which showed that Americans opposed pardoning most January 6th defendants 69 to 31. That's most, so maybe people don't like the idea of most, but they like, they could like the idea of some. But even if the scale of these pardons is smaller than that, I think it's pretty evident that it could be quite unpopular. There was a CBS YouGov poll around the same time that showed that people opposed pardons more broadly by a 62 to 38 margin. And then there's just kind of this more fundamental issue of like, do people agree with Trump that these people have been persecuted by our justice system? And we here at the Washington Post, along with the University of Maryland, had a survey earlier this year, which I think was really good in providing insights on that. It basically asked, do you think that these people have been treated too harshly, or have they been treated about right, or have they been, not treated harshly enough? Just 26% of people said that the sentences for January 6th defendants were too harsh. So there is no universe in which there is a loud clamoring of the American people for letting these people off the hook for what they did that day. And to the extent that Trump pursues that to a significant extent, it's pretty evident that that could be something that the American people decide is a bridge too far for them.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And it does align, I think, with what we heard from voters kind of in the days and weeks before the election. I'm thinking specifically of one person that our colleague, another producer here at the Post interviewed, who was a voter who was leaning Trump. He was sort of on the fence, but he was leaning Trump. And he did bring up, he didn't like what happened on January 6th. He thought it was bad. He thought the violence, was a kind of a mark against him supporting Trump again, but he liked enough other things that Trump was pledging to do, and he liked his message on the economy, and that was enough to potentially get him to vote yes on Trump. But it's interesting. You can kind of see the ways in which voters decided which issues mattered more, what things that they supported that would get them to yes and propel Trump back into the White House. And we're kind of seeing this. It wasn't everything,
I'm really glad that you brought up that point because, I get emails from readers and they're like, well, Donald Trump won this election, pretty decisively in the Electoral College, Isn't that an endorsement of all these things that he was saying? And the short answer is not necessarily. People make their decisions about any number of different things. They might just decide that they don't like the incumbent administration. They might have seen things in Vice President Kamala Harris that they didn't like. There are a number of things that have, over the course of Trump's time in politics, consistently given people pause about him. And so it's a complicated thing. And to the extent that Donald Trump views this election as being a mandate for him to do all of these things, I think that he could find himself rather quickly discovering that's not how the American people necessarily viewed it. And so that's something that I'm really watching in the months ahead is like, how much are allies of Donald Trump, fellow Republicans, cautioning against him doing some of these things? And how persuasive is that to him if they ultimately do that?
That makes a lot of sense. And there's going to be a lot to watch. Those are all my questions, Aaron. It was so great to talk to you again.
Thanks for talking it over with me, Laura. I'm Aaron Blake, senior political reporter and author of the Campaign Moment newsletter.
And I'm Laura Benshoff, a politics producer for audio here at the Post.
If you want more original, deep analysis of campaign news and the Trump transition, make sure you're subscribing to my newsletter, also called The Campaign Moment. You can find a link in our show notes.
And we're still going to be publishing episodes of The Campaign Moment until Inauguration Day on January 20th. Even though the campaign is over, there's still so much important news as the Trump administration takes shape and prepares to assume power once again. So you can keep finding us in your feeds through January.
Today's episode was produced by Laura and mixed by Rennie Svirnovskiy. It was edited by Reena Flores and Mary Jo Murphy. Thanks to Molly Hennessy-Fiske and Lucy Perkins. We'll be back in your feed this Friday with our regularly scheduled episode. Bye for now.
Bye, Aaron.